Oops. Okay, there was a question about, you can see on Twitch, for those of you that are coming in on Twitch, 199-210 is the number. There was a question, even though the current PackBack section is 2 weeks long, we only need to answer one question and two answers, and that's right. We only need to do one question and two answers. I'd say about a little more than half of you have already done the PackBack for this week. But it basically started in spring break, so some people did it during spring break, but you still have until basically this week to write your one question and two answers. And you can answer something from last week, obviously, or this week. Respond to those things. Thanks for doing that. Yes, and welcome. And to those of you that are watching on Twitch, I will continue to do this class on Twitch. We started this way, even though R0 is down. Some people find it easier to show up on Twitch, and so you're welcome. I'm delighted to have you guys here, and I would much prefer you be in person. But if you have to be on Twitch, that's okay with me. So thank you. So this is a crazy week, and I want to talk today about finance. Just a few things. So it turns out that when I started this project, 18 years ago, about wheat, cheap American wheat, and international grain trade, and Ukraine and Russia versus the United States in the 1780s, there was precisely no one who cared about wheat and the international market. And there were precisely three people that cared, and they were all grain traders. I actually dragged my kids to every grain port in Europe, my wife and kids, when we traveled through Europe. And now everybody wants to know about the grain trade because grain prices are going to go up in North Africa and the Middle East. And we're going to see not just conflict in Ukraine, but also conflict all over the world, I think, in the next couple of years, and it's going to have everything to do with the price of food. People in North Africa and much of the Middle East, certain parts of the Middle East, get most of their food. Poor people spend about 30% of their budget on bread, whether it's as noodles or as baguettes or as flatbread or whatever. And those prices are going way up because of the conflict in Ukraine. Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world and has been for 2,000 years. And anyways, so I think I'm going to have a piece in the New York Times. I think I'm going to have a piece in Time Magazine. I think there's going to be a piece. I'm going to be interviewed on CBC and the BBC in the next couple of days because there's not that many people who know about wheat. And so this thing that I nerded out on for a very long time is now suddenly topical, and that's not a thing to be happy about, especially. But that's where we are. Once in a while it's strange. Like you start doing stuff, and people, it suddenly matters. Which is, I wish it didn't matter, but here's where we are. Okay, today I want to talk about the end of the era of good feelings, long-term effect of the food price increase. 2007 and 2008, there were grain prices went up in Ukraine and Russia, in part because of storms, flash storms that, what are they called? Basically fires that spread very, very quickly across Ukraine and Russia. Russia started to put caps on grain exports. Grain prices went up, and Arab Spring was one of the results of that. Arab Spring, which saw the collapse of the Syrian government, collapse of the Egyptian government, all these other sorts of things, was a direct result of increasing grain prices in 2007, 2008. That's nothing compared to what's happening now. So this is going to be, unless the UN brings that grain out of the Black Sea and delivers it to North Africa or the Middle East in the next few months, things are going to be rough, really rough. Okay. Okay. How do I do this? Whoops. I did not mean to refresh that. There we go. Okay, today we are going to talk about wheat because it's one of my obsessions, but as it has to do with the period that we're describing, I am the least happy, I have to say, with Harry Watson's chapter 10. I think its discussion of slavery is highly problematic. The way he discusses, he largely writes about slavery from the perspective of the slave owner, and I think that that's just a ridiculous way to talk about the South. And I want to talk about the change. Reading his chapter made me think that it's important to understand that American history is not defined entirely by slavery. That slavery, and particularly cotton slavery, is a period that I associate with just a very short period, 1820 to 1861. Cotton and slavery are very important in the United States in that period. And how we get there is what we're going to talk about today. How we get to a world where cotton is the major export of the United States around the world is the result of some of the chaos and conflict that happens after the Napoleonic Wars. So this is called the end of the era of good feelings, or why cryptocurrency is sure to fail. Okay, and I promise to connect those things together. So these are the jolly boatmen. And why are the jolly boatmen jolly? They're jolly because the Mississippi River is now open to trade. New Orleans is no longer a place where grain is where exports, American exports, are going to get stopped on their way to the Caribbean. So people in Illinois, Indiana, Illinois and Ohio and North Alabama can produce wheat, turn it into flour, and sell that flour to the Caribbean, and they don't have to pay a tax to a French or Spanish official in New Orleans because, remember, the Haitian Revolution has made Napoleon, after the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon decides that keeping France in control of the Mississippi River Valley is too expensive. He sells that section, the whole corridor of the upper Mississippi Valley, to the United States in a fit of pique. When the United States has control of New Orleans, there's no port and there's no tax at New Orleans. Does that make sense? Okay. And so this is why they're the jolly boatmen. And the jolly boatmen only go in one direction, because you can only go in one direction on a boat like this on the Mississippi River. You build it in Illinois, cut it out of wood, and produce something like this. You float it down the Mississippi River towards New Orleans and towards your market, filled with grain. What else? Primarily flour barrels. There are some other things, pears, dried plums, a few other potatoes, but it's mostly flour barrels that are coming down the Mississippi River. And then when you arrive in New Orleans with that ship, you hand it over along with the flour to someone. You sell it to someone in New Orleans, and now they have a boat in New Orleans that they can't bring back up the river, and so they turn it into a house. So if you go to New Orleans now and look for the old buildings, they are made out of ships or made out of the wood from those ships that are sent down the Mississippi River. Does that make sense? Okay, and this is the U.S. Oh my goodness, so many comments. Bear with me. What do you think will be the long-term effect of the food cost if there will be one? Oh, yeah. Question about whether I could do I am going to do a talk in a couple of weeks. I'll let you know about that, about the book, about those long-term impacts. I'm going to talk on BBC Radio on Friday. I'm going to talk to CBC Radio on Thursday about this. But yeah, I could imagine doing something here about this. This is. Ordinarily I would defer to my colleagues who do Russian history, but what I do is primarily grain, and that's where we're going to be for the next little bit. Okay, sorry. Jolly Boatmen. That shipping down the Mississippi River produces weird effects, has some weird effects. One of them is it helps produce the first mass murderers in the United States. These two folks, Big Harp and Little Harp. These people understand that the Jolly Boatmen, when they get to New Orleans, they sell their wheat, the flour. The flour is going to be sold to Saint Domingue or Jamaica or Barbados or another Caribbean colony primarily. And they're going to have gold going back up home to Illinois or Ohio, right? Back up. And what they do is they walk up, or they don't walk up, they take a horse and they travel in a small group up what's called the Natchez Trace, which you can still follow today. The Natchez Trace, which is a long path that leads up to parallel to the Mississippi River, up to places like Tennessee and northern Tennessee, and on the way to Illinois or Ohio. And Big Harp and Little Harp understand that people are carrying gold with them on their horses on their way back up, and they kill them. Right? They pull them off at Indian trading spots, and they kill them. They take their gold. They'll fill their bodies with rocks, and they toss them in rivers. And it takes almost 10 years for communities to try to find Big Harp and Little Harp. They had been kind of buffaloers. They'd been supporters of the British during the Revolutionary War. They'd become very familiar with how to use guns and how to do ambushes and things like that. And there's a place called Harp's Head, Kentucky. It was called Harp's Head, Kentucky because they finally caught Big Harp. They cut his head off and they put his head on a post. And it stayed there for a number of years. So that's so the Jolly Boatmen are jolly because they're going to get their pay in New Orleans, and they're going to bring that money back up to the farmers further north. But that situation is potentially dangerous. Yeah, do any of the New Orleans houses resemble the boats, or were they all deconstructed completely for the wood? No, there are some pretty near. What's the drinking place that you go to? The place where everybody drinks and throws up in New Orleans? Bourbon Street. Thank you. If you walk down Bourbon Street, you can see actually some arches that are old arches from those houses in the 1820s. Bourbon Street. Thank you. Okay. So, why are the boatmen jolly? The boatmen are jolly because there's chaos in Europe. Because there are wheat fields burning in Europe, because people need flour, people need food, and there's first the French Revolutionary Wars from 1791 to 1803, which are wars in which, basically it's connected to the revolution in France. It's mostly in France, although there are other places. When Napoleon comes to power in 1803, we see what are called the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815, and that is Napoleon, as we said before, marching east and trying to take more and more land. As I said before, his movement, his march on Russia, the fateful march on Russia that destroys much of his army, part of that is because Russia is a rival, but the reason that Russia is a rival is because Russia is providing grain through Ukraine to the other rival powers, particularly Britain, and he wants to stop that flow of grain. Okay. Now I want to talk about credit, because I think we need to understand this sort of credit market and how it is that things start to change and who gets angry about who does well. Flour prices double during the Napoleonic conflict. They sometimes triple depending on issue. The Caribbean colonies are starving for food, and much of that food comes from the United States. The way in which trade works, and it's important to understand this nexus of trade, is we had the dry goods traders before 1811 in this period. They borrow from the Bank of the United States, the first Bank of the United States, right? Because half of the loans to the first Bank of the United States go to the US, half of them go to these merchants. They buy goods from Britain, Brazil, Cuba, and even China, and they sell at a 20% markup, at least, and they get stinking rich. And these are the people who you've heard of. Herman Melville, in part, lives on the wealth of his father, who is a merchant in the 1820s, although his father kind of loses quite a lot. John Jacob Astor, J.P. Morgan's father, Junius Morgan. These are some of the largest and wealthiest families in New York. They're very politically powerful. It's important to understand their political power because, let me just show this again to people on Twitch, 199210. In 1815, that war, the War of 1812 is over. Remember, the War of 1812 is a kind of spillover from the Napoleonic conflicts. By 1815, Napoleon has surrendered. The US and Great Britain are no longer at war. Napoleon is on Elba, the Elba island. He's no longer a threat. And Europe, for the first time for a very long time, is at peace. And British merchants then have the largest Army-Navy surplus sale in the history of the world, because they've been producing these jackets out of wool for the Army and for the Navy, which they now there are no longer any soldiers and sailors in Europe for them to clothe. Does that make sense? Every time a war is over, all this surplus becomes available. Britain has a huge amount of surplus, and so it's selling. I've got a jacket here that's a monkey jacket. A monkey jacket is short, relatively short here around the waist. It's not a long waistcoat, and the monkey jacket. It's actually a little bit. It's hard to see on, but this is a little bit like what a monkey jacket was. It's almost like a baseball jacket, right? It's a little high, and it allows you to climb in the riggings if you're a sailor, because you don't want the sail to get in your way. So they have these half-finished monkey jackets. They don't have the buttons. They also have lots and lots of wool. What do? They sell it to the United States, super cheap. And so hundreds of thousands of unfinished Navy jackets, and they accept credit, these merchants, British merchants, from auction houses in New York. And American farmers buy monkey jackets on credit, because as I said, a jacket is the price of a house in 1818 and 1819. It's very expensive. These are monstrous cheap, as the advertisements say, in 1815. How do they get there? There's a new ship that's called the Black Ball Line. That's a regular ship that travels back and forth from Britain to the United States. Kleinwort & Sons creates it. It provides regular delivery between U.S. and Great Britain after 1815. So you're no longer chartering a ship from Britain to come back to the U.S. or chartering a ship in the United States to go to Britain and back. There's this regular ship that goes basically twice a week. Starts twice a week in one direction, and twice a week in the other direction. New York banks then provide credit to city auction houses so they can buy and sell cheap British woolens. And these New York auction houses sell British coats, woolens, thread, and needles to wholesalers. And people have commented on these auction houses because they're selling at dirt cheap prices, right? For thread and woolens and all these other things at dirt cheap prices. Who's upset about this? The Astors, the Melvilles, and the Morgans, right? Because somebody is now grabbing their business. Somebody else is getting a hold of those goods. And we have these new men who are wholesalers, jobbers they're called, who take over that business. They don't wear silk stockings, right? They have pants that come down to their shoes. They they don't look like, so this, you can see here, this guy in slippers and long pants. This is a kind of, he's like half dressed, according to the period of the age. He's not a wealthy man. He's got a wealthy person's ascot, but he is a newcomer in New York who is willing to buy and sell to country stores. He gets goods from the Black Ball Line ships. He uses credit from the New York banks. He buys these things in the auction houses, and he sells them to merchants in country stores. He lures them into his showroom in New York by sending out salespeople who hang out in bars and buy country dealers expensive mixed drinks. This is the period when mixed drinks emerged, because American alcohol is so nasty that you have to mix it with lots of sugar and lemon and lime and stuff like that to drink it. So mixed drinks start in this period. They ply you with mixed drinks, and then they drag you into the warehouse, the country merchant, and they get you to buy this cheap goods. He makes around 10%, not 20%. And he sells seasonally, not yearly. Okay. So there's a new line of credit to these country stores. There's a proliferation of country stores in these places. And I promise I'll get back to the Mississippi River in a minute. But what happens then, after 1815, is there are lots of banks. There are hundreds of banks. Why? Because remember, 1791 to 1811, those are the years of the first Bank of the United States. 1811, the Bank of the United States collapses. It doesn't collapse, but it folds, right? It sells all its stock off. It's one of the reasons for the War of 1812. And so all these new banks show up. Hundreds of them. And they pay for these things on the right, some of them, steamboats. And steamboats fix the problem of the grain ships, because steamboats can go down the Mississippi River and then back up. Right? So steamboats are funded in large part by banks, and they're called caterpillar banks. Caterpillar banks, you know this, you probably remember from a kid's book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, right? That eats everything in front of it. First it eats through apples, and do you guys know this kid's book, right? The Very Hungry Caterpillar? No? Anyways. Caterpillar banks it's a term that a congressman uses. He said, banks used to be the pillars of our nation, and now they are the caterpillars of our nation, because they eat everything in their path, just like a caterpillar does. They provide credit for steamboats and commerce on the Mississippi, Ohio, and Hudson rivers. But many of these banks that provide funding for this travel are unstable. And some of the banks are indistinguishable from the other banks. And so this is a banknote from the Cumberland Bank of Burkesville. So if you pull out a dollar bill now out of your wallet, I'll pull out a note here. All right, this is a $5 bill. It says Federal Reserve note on the front. It says United States of America. What else does it say? This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. And it also says United States Federal Reserve System. If you're in Britain, though, and you pull out a banknote, it's going to have the name of the bank that it comes from. If you're in Hong Kong and you pull out a banknote, it's going to have the name of the bank that it comes from. In the United States, banknotes in this period are like this. They come from a particular bank, and and every time you look at a banknote, you have to say, do I trust this bank? Do not trust, just FYI, if you travel back in time, never trust the Cumberland Bank of Burkesville, because no one knows where Burkesville is, right? But this looks like a banknote, acts like a banknote. The Cumberland Bank of Burkesville passes out these notes, and they're redeemable in Burkesville. And I don't even know where Burkesville... I think Burkesville is supposed to be in Kentucky, but there's no town of Burkesville. Some of these are called wildcat banks because you can turn them in. You get the banknote, and if you want to redeem it for gold or silver, you have to go to a town that's filled with wildcats. It's so dangerous. Okay, so these are sketchy notes. Some represent goods in transit, just like that merchant does, where the notes are basically how the country store pays the wholesaler back. That's kind of the purpose of those notes, in part. But many of them are just speculative, and few can tell which is which. In a way, this is very much like Bitcoin and Ethereum and all the other cryptocurrencies now. The question you want to ask when you have a currency and you're promised a currency is, does it represent goods in transit? Does it represent monkey jackets going to the west and wheat flowing back to the east or down the Mississippi River? If it doesn't, if it's not a part of regular transactions that regular people are using, you should ask whether there is actually any money here, right? And this is the problem that Bitcoin and Ethereum and others have, is you have to kind of believe that this thing is going to be a legitimate currency at some point in the future to buy it. But if it's not representing currency in transit now, it may never. And that's what's true of more than half of the banks that are exchanging currency in the United States between 1811 and 1819. It's a little bit like musical chairs. If you're left with the note, when the bank fails, you're left with nothing. But can you persuade someone to take this note before the music stops, right? Before this thing is worth nothing. Okay. I don't want to tell you one way or the other whether to invest in Bitcoin, Dogecoin, or Ethereum, but I would suggest that you ask a question about what it represents and whether it represents value in transit. The Panic of 1819 suggests that it will be worth nothing. Okay, so the store provides consumer credit to farmers. There's no currency changing hands. You show up at a country store. The country store sizes you up. They look at you. They decide whether you're good for this currency or not, whether you're good for credit or not. They take a look at your land. They offer you things on credit, and you pay it off when your crops are in. From 1811 to 1815, there is no Bank of the United States, right? The first Bank of the United States ends in 1811. And so this is partly how this proliferation of all these banks come about. This is why the United States is different from almost every other country in the world. Almost every other country in the world, there are 2 or 3 major banks. In the United States, there are hundreds of banks, right? Even with the consolidation, there's Synovus and Truist and Chase Morgan and all these other sorts of things. That's unique to the United States, and that's because of this. That's because of that period between 1811 and 1815, when there's a proliferation of multiple banks, multiple competing banks that spread across the landscape, and really relatively few of them ultimately survive. They want to establish a stable currency. They want to stem the flow of cheap credit to the caterpillar banks with little effect. They're not capable, really, of reining them in. Why? Because the Second Bank of the United States was chartered and written by John C. Calhoun and others that wanted to make sure that there was easy credit in the South. And so the Second Bank of the United States isn't able to distinguish between good and bad currencies. It's told by Congress to accept currency from the frickin' Bank of Kentucky, which has no capital at all. It's told to accept currency from the Bank of Clarksville and the Bank of Burkesville. The land offices is forced to accept these useless banknotes that will never be paid off. And the second bank can travel to where the wildcats are and try to turn them in and try to get the gold and silver for them. You know, the note is actually a promise to pay in gold and silver. Of course, when it does that, we're going to see financial panic because many of these banks do not have anything. Now, on top of this, from 1815 to 1818, insiders in the Second Bank of the United States, along with stockholders in the Caterpillar banks, borrow money and use that borrowed money to borrow land from the Federal Land Office. Right? Remember, I said that the Federal Land Office is the largest bank in the world as a mortgage bank. So people are borrowing money from the bank, which they promise to pay off. They're then taking this borrowed money and paying a little bit down for land, right? And then they're going to pay it off in 3 or 4 years, because of course the price of land is going to go up, right? Of course the price of land is going to go up. But the price of land doesn't go up. Why? Because the war in Europe is over. The war in Europe is over, and more to the point, access to the Caribbean is going to be cut off. Yes, it's true. Other countries today all use this. Use 2 or 3 banks. So in Scotland, there's 2 or 3 banks. In Hong Kong, there's 5 or 6 banks. But in most countries, there's 1 or 2 banks, not 500 banks like we have. All right, and this is where the Melvilles come in, and the Astors, and the others. It's like, enough of this, right? Enough of this nonsense of these caterpillar banks providing all of this credit, providing all these cheap goods. And so they persuade the US to block the flood of cheap British goods, and Congress passes the American Navigation Acts, which tax at a quite high rate British woolens and other goods that are coming in. This is the beginning of a tariff war between the United States and Great Britain. A tariff war which the United States is bound to lose. On top of that, Junius, and I think he gets his degree, it's either from Harvard or from Yale. He's the son of a banker in Maryland, in Baltimore, and he produces the Junius letters, which are the most overwritten pieces of dreck you can imagine, but he has all this inside information about what's going on in the Bank of the United States. He knows about these people who are borrowing to buy land, and then which is self-borrowing. And so he, I'll just read you a line, it destroys the efficacy of the right of suffrage, the rich stockholder only being represented, the poor, the industrious, and these who hold no stock, having no real voice and only a nominal share in the government. They vote, but they vote for stockholders, nominated by a caucus of office holders who vote in their turn when in Congress for themselves and their fellow jobbers. Right. And again, jobbers are those people who are shifting goods back and forth, have a pretty bad reputation. The British letters are published in the Philadelphia Aurora attacking the Second Bank of the United States based on inside knowledge. In May of 1818, the empire strikes back. Britain responds. Britain first passes the passes the Orders in Council, which enforces the British Corn Laws in the British West Indies that say basically you can sell, so the British word, confusingly, the British word for wheat is corn. So the British Corn Laws are actually a tax on wheat. The British Corn Laws are passed that block, or not block, but impose a high tariff on goods coming into the British West Indies. And then in 1818, and this is the kind of most important legislation, I think, in American history. Britain effectively blocks American flour from the British Caribbean, flour going to the British Caribbean, unless it passes through Halifax or St. John. Now, Halifax and St. John are very far north. So you're going to take your Baltimore flour, send it all the way up to Halifax, and then all the way back down to the British Caribbean, right? And it has to go from Halifax to the British Caribbean in a British ship, okay? So effectively the cost is magnified, drastically magnified for that flour. And that flour that's the central thing that the United States economy depends on up until 1818, is flour exports. It's the biggest single export. It's the reason, well, it's this act in 1818 that is the single reason why America switches to cotton in 1819. But first, we're going to have a massive financial crisis. Why? Because all these people have borrowed money to buy their land. All these people have assumed that the price of a barrel of flour is going to be $10 until doomsday, and it's not. Those British Orders in Council and that tax that forces the goods to go through Halifax and St. John mean that the U.S. can no longer sell wheat in the British Caribbean, and the Caribbean is mostly British at this point because Britain has won all of these wars. And so this is the Panic of 1819. Price of flour drops 50%. Farmers are ruined. Banks are ruined. And the response to the Panic of 1819 is a few things. One of them is that flour is no longer going to be America's export. From 1820 to 1861, it's going to be cotton, because flour is blocked by the British Empire. This, I think, is one of the reasons why the United States begins as something like a multiracial democracy, in which black people are voting in New Orleans, black people are voting in Boston. There's a sense that slavery is likely to end. By 1820, that world is gone. By the Panic of 1819, selling flour and wheat to the British Caribbean, selling the U.S., being a provider of food, that era is over. And the era of good feelings, the era when Federalists and Democrats, and the Democratic Republicans, everybody was a Democratic Republican. The Federalists had kind of disappeared. The era of good feelings at last from, say, 1812 to 1819 is over. And politics splits harshly in four directions: the Crawford Caucus, the Adams Caucus, the Clay Caucus, and the Jackson Caucus. Packback is on chapters 8 and 9 this week. I think that's right. Is that right? Okay, yeah. So chapter 10 is worth looking at as an example of a not very good history. So, okay. So what does that mean? What's the long-term effect of this? First of all these banknotes are useless. I used to bring them around. I actually have a desk filled with old banknotes from 1811 to 1819, which you can buy on eBay for almost nothing, because they're still worth almost nothing. And not almost nothing, but you pay $20 or $40 for an old $20 banknote from 1815, because it's never going to be redeemed, right? So what are the long-term effects of the Panic of 1819? First of all, lots of farmers lose their land because they're buying it on credit. Even the ones who are pretty responsible, right? Who just don't have bank accounts, or just have an account with their local country store and have bought 80 acres or 120 acres or something like that, and are paying it off in installments to the land office. They can't make those payments anymore once the price of wheat goes through the floor, right? Once the price of wheat is down. And so those people, the Second Bank of the United States, the land office is still reselling that land that people have given up as late as 1860. Okay, this is the biggest panic in the 19th century. Biggest financial panic in the 19th century. It only happens in the United States. So that happens. The question is who to blame. Who's at fault, right? And as I would suggest, it's very complicated. It's not that complicated, but it's somewhat complicated who's at fault. Is it the fault of the jobbers, those newcomers? Not really. Is it the fault of the farmers? Not really. Is it the fault of the people who borrowed money from the Bank of the United States and then used that to borrow land from the land office? Well, yeah, those people lost big. One of the people who lost big, I've forgotten his name now, was a good friend of Thomas Jefferson's. And he was governor of Virginia. He owned 100,000 acres in Western Virginia. And Thomas Jefferson's son needed a job, and Governor Dinwiddie, wait, is that right? No, it's not. That's not Governor Dinwiddie. Anyways, this governor, it's Virginia's governor in around 1805. I'll look it up. Goes to Jefferson and says, "Look, I'm in a bit of a bind. I've got a credit crunch. Can you guarantee my notes?" And in 1811, he does. He guarantees all of his notes. He signs underneath. Jefferson had said that he would free all of his slaves on his death. But Jefferson loses everything with the failure of this governor, who had leveraged and leveraged and leveraged everything and promised his notes because he was a good friend. And Jefferson lost Monticello, and the family lost Monticello. All the enslaved people who were his own children, some of them, moved back into slavery in this period. This is the Panic of 1819. And from 1819 to 1860, the only thing the United States can export to the British Empire cheaply and easily is cotton. And so this is how the United States becomes a cotton empire, from 1820 to 1861. The end of slavery will finish that off. So it's only 40 years, right? And this is the thing that's confusing about Chapter 10, if you look at it, is this idea that the South has been a cotton region for a long time. No. The South is dominated by cotton from 1820 to 1861, just 41 years, just the lifetime of one person. And it'll end with the Civil War. Okay? We'll talk about the rise of Jackson and the splitting of that party into 4 parts. I had meant to do a quiz, but I think that didn't happen today, and I think there's a fairly good chance we'll have a quiz next class. Thanks so much, everybody. And thanks so much for you guys who came in. It's awesome to see you.